This is a Hope 1032 podcast.
As followers of Jesus, in whom all things were made, we acknowledge the Darug people as the traditional custodians of the country on where this podcast is recorded. We recognise their continuing connection to the land and waters and thank them for protecting this land and its ecosystems since time immemorial. We pay our respects to elders past, present and future, and we extend that respect to all First Nations peoples listening today. I'm Georgia, and welcome to Finding Hope, the podcast that reminds you of the good in the world. Each episode tells the story of someone who has found real hope in some challenging times and also made the world a better place. Episode 57, Mike Gore. Mike Gore is no stranger to a microphone. With more than 20 years leadership experience, he's shared passionately about his work with countless people. He's the previous CEO of Open Doors Australia, who work with and advocate for persecuted Christians all over the world. His latest venture is changing the way we give to charities and not-for-profits. Charitable is Australia's first app-based giving platform, basically a one-stop shop for generosity and donations. I'm so excited to have Mike with me in person. It's so rare that this happens on the Finding Hope podcast. Welcome to Finding Hope, Mike.
Georgia, thanks for having me. It's actually, how good does it feel to be sitting in a room together?
Oh, especially after COVID, the amount, look, I love talking to people over Zoom, but it's so nice to not have a screen between us.
Yeah, and the awkward pauses over Zoom. I mean, they're okay, but it gets a little bit draining.
There's no lag here. There's no lag in person. Mike, let's take a walk down memory lane for you to start with. In school, when you were asked the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? Did you ever envisage yourself being a leader, a CEO of sorts?
No, to be honest, a cricketer. I grew up playing cricket. Cricket was my sport. I've got a whole story before I find myself here or even in school. Born in India, adopted when I was 6 months old, all sorts of interesting parts there. But my dad was a cricketer, my adopted father, so white Australian guy. Me being a good Indian heritage boy, cricket was my thing. I was good at it. And so growing up, I guess all I ever dreamed of being was a professional sports player. Knew nothing about leadership, business, CEO, or any of that sort of stuff. I just wanted to play cricket.
Tell me a little bit about that childhood. Obviously, there is inherent trauma in adoption. You're growing up in a white family. How was your childhood growing up? Did you ever sense any of that kind of hardship?
Yeah, look, that is such a broad question, a great question, but a broad question. Originally, and for the listeners and viewers, I was born as a Hindu. In India, I was abandoned at birth, from what I understand, and found by a paediatrician in a field. Within India, there is a religious system, I guess, of oppression, I'd call it. It's called the caste system, where you're classified by the way in which you're born determines, I guess, the hierarchy, your family of origin. And within Hinduism, they believe that what you've done in your previous life, Georgia, determines the circumstances amidst which you were born. And so for me to be left in a field, abandoned by a biological mother, was a heinous kind of viewpoint of what I must have done previously. So placed into an orphanage, but unable to be adopted because of the belief that whatever I've done in my previous life had determined the circumstances amidst which I'd been born and therefore did not qualify for adoption. That was in 1981. Now, in 1977, a family in Australia with two biological daughters of their own, Christian family, they had applied for an adoption. But over the following 4 years, heard a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of red tape, and basically nothing conclusive about adoption. So in 1981, the year that I was born, they decided on giving up on adopting a child. In fact, they wanted to close that chapter. They spent the money they had saved on a trip to Disneyland, believe it or not, with their two biological daughters. I mean, the happiest place on world to close a chapter and move on in life. So they decided to do that and go to America and forget about the hope of adopting a child. Now, while I was placed in this orphanage, a lady there called Vimala, I don't know her, I've never met her, know nothing more than her by name on a piece of paper. She took a liking to me. And one night she grabbed me and she smuggled me across a state border. She took me to another orphanage run by nuns. She bribed them with cash, as the story goes, asked them to change my birth certificate so that I could be adopted under a different state's law. And ultimately, that's what happened. The nuns accepted the bribe, they changed my birth certificate, and I was therefore eligible to be adopted. This family got back from their trip to India with their 2 biological daughters. They got a phone call saying, the adoption's gone through and your son will be at the airport at the weekend.
Oh.
And they said, no way, not a chance. I mean, we can't afford it. We have no money. And as a Christian family that night, they prayed. I'm sure those prayers that night were not necessarily your atypical, God, everything's going to be all right. They were like, my gosh, help. Anyway, the next day, the lady was driving a car with her 2 biological daughters. She had a car crash, wrote the car off without a scratch or a bruise to anyone in the car.
Oh, my goodness.
And she said to me, Mike, what was a miracle was that 2 days later, the day before you were due to arrive at Sydney Airport, the insurance money had been returned to our bank account, and it was to the exact dollar that was needed to pay for your adoption.
Get out of here.
Not a dollar more, not a dollar less. And so that was how I ultimately ended up in Australia. But I mean, it's a very, very long-winded way of answering your question. But the hand of God to sort of pull me out of that nation is undeniable. But that's not where the journey ended. In many ways, it's where it began. Because I grew up in the Sutherland Shire in Sydney, the southern suburbs. I was the only brown-skinned kid in school until I was 16. I remember all sorts of issues. I remember walking across the playground as must have been in year 4, a girl in year 6 walking up to me and saying, "You black mother," and spitting all over me. I have had people come into my front yard with hockey sticks. I still have racism most months as a 42-year-old now living in northwest Sydney. Could tell you story after story after story that would blow your mind. And so when it comes to my experience of adoption, it's actually been overwhelmingly good, right? Because where I found a sense of identity, in particular for me, was in the church, Georgia. Right, I was at school and, man, I was looked at as a different person everywhere I went. I mean, my middle name is Kartik. It was my Indian first name, but my parents changed it to be Michael Kartik Gore, and that allowed me in 1981 to fit into Australian culture. Yeah. I'll tell you what, every single time we went to school and they said, we're going to read the roll today and read everyone's first, middle and surnames, I always cringe thinking, it's going to get to that point where they can't pronounce that name and everyone's going to know. And so those kind of things. At school, I was always different. Every room I ever walked into, I was different. The only brown kid in any basically room I've ever walked into. But at church, I was always just one of the Gore family. So I could turn up with my parents and my 2 sisters and I would be chastised as much as anyone else when I was doing things wrong. The ladies at morning tea, they treated me lovely, but they'd also reprimand me. I was just me. And so the church helped really forge a sense of strong identity, to loving parents that have helped shape and grow and develop my identity. So yeah, there has been traumatic elements to it, but the sort of firm foundation to it all has been some fantastic parenting, a church community that gave me a sense of identity and have built me up to drive me to what I do today, which is hopefully devote a life towards generosity.
Yeah, that's incredible. Thank you so much for sharing. Mike, what was the kind of point as you were growing up? You obviously said, you wanted to be a cricketer. Was there a point where you're like, I don't know, you realize it, like your calling was somewhere else, so you realize you could actually kind of do this whole leader thing and really kind of guide others? Or was it something you more fell into, or a bit of both?
Yeah, look, it's entirely the latter is that I fell into it. I'm a fairly passionate believer, and this is not to make you feel weird, is that I'm like, I think if anyone says you need to be called to something, run. I have a totally different lens on that. I mean, the amount of times I've heard Christians speak the word over people, particularly when it comes to not-for-profit work or church work, you must be called to work here. If you ever hear that, run, right? Because my calling is to love God and to love people.
Yeah.
I can do that stacking shelves at Target. I can do it leading organizations, and I can do it being a father or a parent, right? And my wrestle is I watch it destroy people's spiritual worth and values when they either feel like I didn't get the job but I felt I was called to it, or I lost my job but I was called. And what happens in the middle of that is an incredible fallout spiritually. And so I'm a firm proponent of saying it's not about calling. Our calling as Christians, male, female, young, old, is simply to love God and love people. So I've never really chased a job in my life. Right, I have worked at different places. I started out in sort of my working in the Christian world at Coorong, a bookshop, but moved through the ranks there, not applying for anything, but just saying yes to everything. If someone gave me an opportunity, well, I chased it and I did it. But I've never chased a title, I've never chased a salary, and I will refuse to do so ongoingly, because I think if we're not careful, we need to be focused on living a life more defined by who we are, not what we do. And if I look around society and culture today, it is a world where people define each other based on what they do, not on who they are. And I think that's a great risk for all of us, but Christians in particular.
And you've had such a, I guess, different experience of what Christianity is, especially with your work with Open Doors. How did you remain hopeful in such painful and hard situations? You were faced with, the hardest stuff every single day. Having to relay that to the rest of Australia who don't really understand kind of what true persecution is like often. How did you personally kind of deal with that?
I think that's one of the big challenges, was actually understanding that the persecuted church is overwhelmingly a story of hope. I mean, you cannot look at it any other way. In Western cultures, we too often measure our proximity to God based on his provision of safety. So, Georgia, we say, hey, God is good and my life is going well when things are going well. Right? God is near, God is close. But what I learned in the persecuted church, it's a paradigm of the persecuted church, or the paradox, is that it's often almost the opposite. They would say, we would say in the West that suffering is an absence of God. They would say it's a drawing near of God. If faith doesn't cost you something, then you're probably not shaking enough cages. It's part and parcel of the faith journey. But you come forward 2,000 years from Christ's time on earth, and in Western cultures, we often only preach a highs gospel, right? A gospel earmarked by blessing, prosperity, wealth. I've seen a lot of Christians survive persecution, but very few prosperity. And I think it's one of the great challenges of the Western church is success, right, has often bred a sense of ego that will ultimately edge God out, ego. And I think that's what I've learned in the persecuted church. It's paradoxically different. It doesn't mean that we should chase suffering. And the naive interpretation of that in Western cultures is that you see people, they chase persecution more than they chase Jesus. So they say needlessly inflammatory things, trying to elicit a response, saying, hey, I'm putting my hand up, man, I've been persecuted. No. What I see in the persecuted church is people chase Jesus. Out of the overflow of chasing Jesus, there is often a cost, and that cost can have a variety of labels, being persecution, a mixture of violent or non-violent. In Western cultures, our naive misinterpretation of that is that we can chase persecution over Jesus. So we get involved in conversations about things like gender, values, morals, society, and then we put our hands up and say, I'm being persecuted because I'm a Christian. No. You're being naive and saying ignorantly inflammatory statements that actually do not denote the viewpoint of Jesus. That's not persecution.
I love what you said, that if your faith isn't costing you something, you're not shaking enough cages. What does that look like in the Western church, where there is such a lack of persecution among Christians, really? Yeah,
I think that, well, one of the things I have learned with the persecuted church is that it's the acts of non-violent persecution that are far more effective at suppressing the church than violent. And what I mean by that is it's when culture sort of overwhelms the church and leaves you relatively ineffective, inefficient. And that's the best form of persecution, and that's rife within Western culture, right? And I think we often can say, well, look, our lives aren't as hard as this, and we're not being persecuted like they are in the Middle East. And, well, no, actually, it's probably worse here. Worse in many ways, because it's the non-violent persecution that renders us complacent, slow-moving. And I think that's one of the real challenges for the Western church, is that we need to know what it means to courageously follow Christ. And that means, I think, discipleship. Like, under those kind of settings, I would say that discipleship is of far greater importance to the church than evangelism, because it's out of the overflow of a truly courageously discipled relationship with Christ that true evangelism happens. Whereas we've come up with a gospel that is often success measured by numbers. You don't feel like a good enough Christian unless you're evangelizing or talking to your non-Christian friends. Well, actually, what I think we need first to do is focus on discipleship. Get back to understanding. And when I say discipleship, I mean of lifers, multi-decade serving Christians, people who have been in church for years and years and years. I think that's of absolute importance to the forward movement of the church in this country.
And what does that kind of look like practically, like day to day? If we were to go out and disciple others, what do you imagine?
Look, I think in today's world, it's embracing what I would call the messiness of life, understanding that bad things happen to good people. To be honest, things like divorce will happen within Christian communities. Things like LGBTIQ plus issues will emerge within Christian parents because our kids are growing up in a different society. I think unless we start to learn what it means to have a realist gospel, to embrace the breadth of the messiness of life, and to realize that God went to the cross for his love for you, me, ISIS, LGBTIQ plus people, whatever it might be. No one is beyond salvation. Doesn't mean we worship the same God. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that no one is beyond salvation. If Saul wasn't, then you know what? My family member or niece who is wrestling with gender means she's not either. And I think for us, discipleship means understanding the breadth of Christianity, the messiness of life, and learning how to follow Jesus in a rapidly evolving and changing world. Because actually, the message of Jesus doesn't change, but the method of delivery must.
Mike, let's talk about your current work, Charitable. I love what you're doing. For those who have never heard of Charitable, what is it and what are you aiming to do with this platform?
Yeah, thanks. Look, it's Australia's kind of first app-based donation platform. I think that having worked for 12 years with Open Doors, 7 as CEO, I really built it to solve the problems for that charity, but realised, apps cost like hundreds of thousands of dollars to build. I mean, they are very, very expensive. But for me as a generous person, I don't actually want hope and compassion, all these other people to go around and having to spend all of the cost of technology on their own thing. So I thought, man, what if we just created like the Uber Eats of giving or like the Menu Log or Amazon or whatever it is? Because if I'm honest, and for most viewers of this podcast or listeners, and for you and I, Georgia, I'm like, there's 5 C's, I call it, that we want in life these days. We want to have choice, right? And so we want to have convenience, we want to have confidence, we want to have a sense of community, and we want to be in control. Right? So if I think about it in life, I live in apps to do that. I live in like things like Amazon or Uber Eats. They give me choice. They're secure. They give me confidence. They give me control. I can order what I want when I want. They're convenient because they combine all these other places in one kind of setting, right? And they allow me to have a sense of community, to be part of something bigger. Mm-hmm. And so Charitable is that. It's like the Uber Eats of donating. You can find any charity you want. You get an annual giving statement whereby you don't have to go looking for receipts at tax time. You can stay in touch by liking your favorite charities. Like you don't have to worry about having noise from other ones. But actually, you can give quickly. You can keep the work of people going forward. And I think that's the biggest issue facing the not-for-profit sector. We have been inherently behind the 8 ball because we say, man, my message matters most. If we need to keep our people with our people, and if they find out about anyone else doing something similar, we risk losing them. That's not true. They already know about it, right? Because I'm a user. I already know about them. And on Uber Eats, I still order from my favorite restaurants. But you know what? I just use the scaffold of Uber Eats to do it because it makes my life easier. So that was my dream. Build something that made it easier for people to be generous and offer it to the breadth of society, because if we can increase generosity, we can lower the cost of charities, and therefore we can increase the impact of every dollar raised.
That's awesome. What's been the most challenging part about the journey so far?
Oh my gosh, where do you begin? If I'm being raw and honest, I didn't realize what it would cost me. Not financially, but from an Open Doors perspective, I didn't really expect to find myself solely working in Charitable as quickly as I did. I knew it would come, but probably not as quickly. So that's been a hard part of the journey. We have had some negative press at times because people will misassume, in one particular instance, people misassumed my skin color and in a secular environment labeled me as a scammer. And that's heartbreaking when people start calling you and making assumptions having not known you. So I didn't expect the cost of kind of the personal side of it in a world of cancel culture. It's very easy to be cancelled, and you can't defend that. There's no way of sort of standing up to that. The stress of providing a service that is new and disruptive. The hardest people to get on board at the moment are charities, not users. We've got users left, right, and centre wanting to give to charities. But we've got charities sort of being very, very cautious of the technology, and I get it. But they're worried about competition. They can't see how you use an app. And well, we've got a website. Why do we need this? And kind of pioneering new space is something that we just need to be patient with. So they're not in and of themselves mission ending or destructive or negative. They're just hurdles that are time draining, emotionally draining, and hard to keep the energy going.
How have you found the work-life balance? You know, you've got a wife, 2 beautiful daughters. Do you kind of find it hard to not bring work home, I guess?
No, I've never found that to be the case. But what I am passionate about is involving them in my work. I think that, so I've got a 13-year-old and a 10-year-old, and from as long as I can remember, I mean, Brooke, when she was, crawling, would be sort of at open doors events back in the day. And I think that's really important, is that you can involve your kids in your work. Too often in life, we really talk about having clear boundaries. The reality is, in a modern world, there aren't those clear boundaries. You can hold them rigidly, but actually you find you spend more energy in trying to be rigid about them, and you end up becoming beholden to them than I think if you went the other way and just kind of embrace them. And so, yeah, I involve them in the work we do. And I also try and, on a weekend, I'll challenge myself to say yes to everything the girls ask me to do. Right now, yes, there's frameworks. I mean, they know not to go and say, well, can we buy a car or what? But if it's like, hey, can we play Barbies? Can we put makeup on you? Great. Can we play tennis? Can we go outside? Can we do this? Just challenge myself to say yes, because it's a lot easier for me to go to the inbox or think about work. But by just saying yes to everything from them from Friday evening to Sunday night, it means that they have my attention and my presence, but it doesn't mean that I'm setting hard boundaries. I could be journaling, I could be writing, but if they interrupt me and say, hey, can we do this? Yes, is my answer.
What does, I feel like so many of us, have an idea of what a daily routine or a lifestyle of a CEO is like, and I'm guessing it's very inaccurate for most people. What does a daily routine look like for you?
Yeah, I think that one of the great misnomers in the world is, look, the higher you go, the less you do. I mean, particularly when you have a team, it's just the more emotional weight you manage. That was the biggest thing I noticed with Open Doors. Being the CEO there, it was just under a $10 million organisation, 30 staff across 2 countries. The higher I went, the less I actually did, but the more emotional weight of others I carried. And so we often can esteem CEOs and look to them, but actually the people, to be honest, and it's not a chivalrous thing, the people who do all the work are the people, inverted commas, below you. I mean, the only hierarchies in life are man-made, right? We like to esteem others or glorify others. The reality is I'd never had more time than when I was a CEO to be able to drop the kids off at school or to pick them up. I had to carry the heavier, meatier topics, and they came with a greater weight and a greater stress. But actually, my job and my firm belief as a CEO is that value contribution and self-belief are linked. Right? When you know where and how you add value, you believe in yourself. So my job as CEO is simply to put people in positions where they could add value and then reinforce it through specific encouragement. Because, Georgia, when you believe in yourself, when you know where and how you add value to the greater picture at Hope, well, if you believe in yourself at work, you begin to believe in yourself at life, home, church, work, friendship circles. So my job as CEO is nothing more than help people reach their full potential, put them in positions where they can add value, and reinforce it through specific encouragement. It made it one of the greatest privileges and greatest jobs on the planet. But it's not crazy. It's not overburdening. I got up, I exercised, I was available for the kids. I wanted to make sure I lived that from the top so that if other families had sick kids, bring them to work. That's fine. I literally do not care because ultimately we're all here serving together for the same cause. You want to go and leave early? It's not an issue in Christian circles of people working too little. It's usually the opposite, too much, because everywhere you go on a weekend, people ask you about your job and how's Open Doors or charitable or Hope. It's not an issue of working too little. We need to understand that and embrace it and help people add value.
How did you kind of deal with those heavier, meatier topics? You said a bit about being an emotional weight, but it does take a toll. How did you kind of deal with that yourself? Did you have certain outlets or ways that you work through them?
Look, I love God and I love people, right? And so the privilege of walking people through, complicated fertility processes, difficult marriages, hard work-based issues. I love coaching and developing people. So that side of it, it was weighty, but I am my best self when I feel like I'm adding value to helping people navigate those. And so for me, it was a great privilege to do that sort of stuff. Where I probably struggled more was the weightiness of things like banking and external conduct standards and board governance and those kind of things, which are well and truly outside of my my competency. It wasn't that I lacked competency. It just wasn't my jam. It didn't bring me to life. And so the weightiest subject matters for me were those elements of getting bogged down in real compliance-based stuff that I didn't feel confident in. I didn't feel like I lacked it terribly, but it just wasn't me. And so those kind of things, I would often look to others to get help. So I would reach out to people. I would open-handedly say, hey, this is not my skill set. Can you help? I think that's one of the great challenges of CEOs is the ability to ask for help. And never to be too proud to be kind. I am more than happy to say I literally have no clue about this. I may be the CEO, but I have no idea. Can you help? Mm-hmm. Value contribution and self-belief. Because if you are gifted in that ability to help, well, you're adding value. I'll reinforce it through specific encouragement and we all grow. Right? Never be too proud to be kind.
We've talked a lot about leaders and what you've done as a leader, what you believe a leader should be. What actually is a leader to you?
It's the age-old question, isn't it? I think leadership is about influence. And that means that anyone can be a leader because it's all about a sense of influence. And if you have influence over others, then you're a leader. It can be used for good and it can be used for evil. And I think some of the greatest leaders in the world are some of the horrific ones, and you look back through world history and some of the most horrific leaders are actually exceptional leaders. The problem is they use their influence for bad. And so for me, leadership is simply about influence.
What do you think is one of the biggest challenges facing leaders today?
Success. I think that ego is a really big issue. I think that it is the best friend of success. It is the destroyer of character and is the enemy of the church because ego will always edge God out. And I think we live in a society and culture that now more than ever espouses the number of likes you get based on, that's almost like the metric people use for success. How liked am I? How many shares do I get? How popular am I? How many people are reaching out to me? They're all elements that foster and fuel ego. And I think for leaders, that's one of our biggest challenges, particularly in the Christian world, particularly in the church world, right? Out of our best intention efforts to market, to promote, to grow the reach of Christ within our communities, we can inadvertently not realize that those tentacles of ego and success have sort of leached their way onto us, and then we make it all about us, and that's a big problem.
Mike, talking to you, it's clear that you're a very grounded person. Well, that's what I feel like. How do you remain so?
Yeah, it's a good question. I do a lot of work on that. I would see a psychologist regularly, and I think for any listeners out there, unmasking some of the taboos around mental health. I've seen a psychologist now for I couldn't even tell you how many years.
Same.
And
Therapy's great.
it is like it builds me up to be a bigger, badder, and stronger version of myself. Right. I think that too often we've looked at that historically and gone, oh, that's all that sort of emotional, touchy-feely stuff. No way. That's just like it's an incredibly important routine to calibrate yourself in leadership, but life in general. We do exercises outside of the psychologist, but for our teams at Open Doors, but now charitable. We do exercises where monthly we're looking at what we call our buckets. We can often talk in life about the fact that, I'm feeling down today, or I'm feeling up today, or I'm feeling low today. And in a whole of life sense, it can affect our moods and our days. And so what we do is we break it down into 4 buckets. You have your physical, your spiritual, your emotional, and your creative. And what we do is we get people to go through and just plot their waterline. Right, in the physical, are you active? Are you feeling where you want to be physically or low? Right, spiritually, are you feeling close to God or distant from Him? You don't have to be Christian. Like, are you feeling connected to a greater cause or not? Right? Emotionally, do you have the capacity? So it's not about happy or sad. It's about the capacity to carry emotion. Is it full or is it empty? And then creative, do you feel creative or not? And what you can find is actually, I'm fit, I'm exercising, I'm active, my physical bucket's good. I'm reading my Bible, I feel sort of close and connected to God. That's pretty good. COVID, to be open and honest, man, he'd like punched holes in that emotional bucket and just drained it. And so all of a sudden that's just completely and utterly tapped out. And then creative is somewhat low for me. And I go, oh, there it is. That's a link, right? It's not that I feel rubbish in my whole of life. It's actually that my emotional bucket is just cooked, and I need to spend time replenishing that, because there's a direct link between that and creative. And so people might go, great, so how do you replenish your emotional bucket? Well, actually what I'll try and do is work on the other two, because I'll pull the others up, right? And so I'll go make sure I stay exercising. I'll push back into the Lord. I might go and do something out in nature, go to the beach, take some photos, do some painting, do like something that brings up the buckets. But that's a really important exercise in remaining grounded, is realizing that too often we say, I feel good or I feel bad, I feel low or I feel high. No, break it down into buckets, get a picture of what part of your life and area is under pressure. And when you can do that, it really does, it changes everything.
That's such important advice. And I think, especially when we're feeling low, it's easy to just blanket statement, everything is terrible. That has honestly changed my whole perspective on the whole thing. I'm going to try that when I get home. Mike, what gets you out of bed in the morning?
I love God, I love people, and I love building something out of nothing. If you give me a job that ticks those boxes, man, I'll jump out of bed a happy guy every day of the week. And as I said before, my calling is not in what I do, it's in who I am. Love God, love people, love building something out of nothing. I can do it stacking shelves at Target, or I can do it running an organization. I don't actually care what the title is. What I care about is I love God, I love people, and I love building something out of nothing.
Has there ever been a point in your life where that hasn't worked? You know, that hasn't got you out of bed and you need to like dig deeper for something else?
No, that's actually what's kept me going. But there has been times where unbelievable hurt and betrayal have wanted to keep me in bed. When you're driven by a love for God, a love for people, and a love for building something out of nothing, well, what's the easiest way? What's your kryptonite? What's the way to hurt you? Is to question your spirituality, is to question your people, leadership, or ability, and to take away the thing that you love the most. Right? And there's been different times in my life through different elements of opposition where each one of those three, or all three of those at times, have been questioned. They're the hard days. Right? So what I come back to is a value statement that I've said, and in a leadership and coaching sense, which I do with a lot of people, the first part of our coaching program is to write a value statement. It's a statement that says, hey, when I lay on my deathbed and look back over my life, I want to make sure that I lived up to the expectations I had. And so I have some daily affirmations that I run and say that help me get me out of bed. You know, called out, set apart, appointed as a prophet to the nations, speaking to crowds, influencing lives, leading people and organizations with wisdom, knowledge, understanding, and insight to a Christ-centered greatness. I'm consistent in my character and genuinely desire the success of others by valuing people and the purpose for which they exist. My family is a source of joy and renewal. And it goes on. But it reminds me every day of why I need to get out of bed, because under certain environments and under pressure, when things are being questioned, they're the days I don't want to get out of bed. So the three things have always got me out of bed, but the wrestle is often that it's when they're under attack or opposition that you don't want to. So you have to remind yourself why you want to get out of bed.
Are you willing to share about some of those hard times that you've dealt with?
Yeah, look, I think leading any team of organisation of people is there are different times where staffing issues come to the surface, and there are times that I feel like I've handled them well and times I feel like I've handled them poorly. There are people who you have previously worked with that fall into what I call the body count, people who, at the expense of your leadership style, could be friends that have not resonated, not gelled well, people who you've worked with in previous organizations that come to your new one, but what they fail to realize, and no matter how much you tell them, right, it's kind of like, I always say, hey, it's like we're going to a new school, because people often say, man, I used to work with you here and you were this kind of person, it was so much fun. I'm like, yeah, you can come, but we have to restart the friendship again. It's like we're in a new playground, a new school, there are new rules. We can still be friends, but the relationship has to foster and develop and grow under this new playground and school rules. Inherently, in my life, that's always turned to, it's just not worked. And they're the hardest ones. People that you go, hey, there's now a certain perception of me that may or may not be true. It is from their lens, but it may not have seen the whole picture from mine. They're hard. I find them really hard because in our Christian worldview, people don't realise that forgiveness is one-sided, reconciliation is two. The reality is that we misalign and misattribute forgiveness to being reconciliation. No. Forgiveness is one-sided, reconciliation is two. The reality is you can forgive someone, but you may never reconcile with them. And I think that's a really important posture when it comes to forgiveness, because all of a sudden it takes the power out of it being a two-sided thing. And it means that I can be hurt and the other people can be hurt. We can both forgive, but we may never reconcile. That's been a hard journey for me to go on because I'm a rescuer. I like to help people. I don't like when we're out of balance. And those are the hardest ones, Georgia, where they are people-based issues, maybe attributed to in part my leadership, but at the same time a bigger story that they may not have seen either, but it fractures relationship.
How has your faith evolved over the years that you've been doing this work, Mike?
I've walked through a really difficult season in the last 10 months where I would say I've been on a bit of a bender with faith in that I have spent the last 10 or 12 months looking for freedom from God. But in that journey, I found freedom in God. And that's a really important distinction. And my guess is there are people watching this and listening to this that are in the same boat. There are people who are under the environmental pressures of the last 3 years and many other life pressures and all sorts of things. There are people who have been rock bottom spiritually. When you think of those buckets, spiritual, physical, emotional, creative, a link between the emotional and the spiritual, you get low in those buckets and it becomes a pretty difficult old prospect. And so I've spent the last 12 months doing my best to run from God, but I found freedom in God. And that's a really powerful journey of which I'm still coming back. If I would say where I was 3 years ago spiritually, it was a 10, I'm a 6, a fragile 6. But embrace the messiness of life, understand there is a highs and lows gospel, and realize that it's a journey that makes us great, that God has a purpose and a plan for our lives, and it's a journey that makes us great, is really important.
How did you find God again?
Well, we're controversial. I didn't find him in the church. I really struggle to reconcile some of the actions of Christians over the last 12 years who do it out of a lens of self-righteousness, but actually end up having a destructive impact on those around them. I really wrestle with that. In fact, I see a lot of that in the church today. People who would judge God based on their viewpoint and lens of the actions of Christians around them. The reality is there are no good people. In fact, Christians aren't good people. We are all broken people who acknowledge our need and desire to do good. The wrestle is, and I'm as guilty in this as possible, is that we spend our lives trying to prove God's goodness by justifying to others our goodness. So we say, look, I'm a Christian and my life is good and I'm a good person. And because of that, God is good and Jesus is good and you should follow him. I'm like, it's a fundamental flaw of my evangelism, and my guess is others, is that the longer I try and project God's goodness by, living up to my own sense of goodness, my gosh, the bigger the friction is when there's a fallout. And so that's the journey I've been on, is that I've struggled to reconcile Christian actions towards me in a variety of settings, but then I've misplaced that in God, an act of God's injustice or justice or goodness or serving him, or when I've devoted a life to this, how can I be here? And they're all warped, backwards misunderstandings of faith. And I'm on a journey of, again, understanding a realist gospel, embracing the messiness of life, because what I see echoed in the Christian world is we use the gospel as a guillotine for others and a pillow for ourselves. And I'm sick of doing it.
In your perspective, as someone who has recently been through, changed perspective of the church, shall we say, what does the church have to start to do in order to not push so many people away?
I think for starters, we need to acknowledge that the church has done an overwhelmingly amount of good. I think it's very easy to have a negative posture towards the church. In fact, I think being a pastor is probably one of the hardest jobs on the planet, to be honest. And I am just so respectful of pastors. And the church in Australia, for generations, has done an overwhelming amount of good. In fact, having spent 12 years working with the persecuted church, I mean, even the secular world acknowledges the net positive influence that a church community has on societies the world over. It's not without controversy, but world history would say that the presence of a church has been overwhelmingly good in general for societies and communities. So, straight up, the church is a good institution, and this is not an anti-church message. What I would say is that over the years working with the persecuted church, we sort of distilled or looked to the persecutors to say, look, what are the 4 ways to kill your church without ever knowing it? Right? How do persecutors systematically dismantle churches the world over, and is it kind of relevant to us today? And so those 4 ways are as the answer to your question, right? Number 1 is mess with the message. What we see in the persecuted world is that religions, governments, people wanting to control or dismantle faith, they will mess with the message. It's a Jesus plus gospel, an additive gospel. In China, a communist nation, they'll say, look, well, you can preach about Jesus, but you must also preach about loving your country. And eventually it becomes so ambiguous between, are you talking about God or the leader, that you've messed with the message and it's a Jesus plus gospel, an additive gospel. Now you jump into Western cultures and context, and you ask, well, what parts of a Jesus plus gospel are we preaching? Because if we only preach a highs gospel, a mountaintop gospel, well, that's an additive, a Jesus plus or a Jesus minus gospel, right? And that's the wrestle, is that if we don't have a theology of suffering, when suffering or opposition comes, we don't, and we're not ready for it. So the church needs to understand to not mess with the message, to preach an all-inclusive gospel, not inclusivity in a secular sense, inclusive of highs and lows, suffering and freedom. Don't mess with the message, right? Next is they would compromise the community. And so in former Russia, you would find they would plant spies within churches. Now, the sole goal of the spy would be to start a salacious rumours about the pastor. He's sleeping with someone in the choir or whatever it might be, right? And they knew that eventually, by the time that rumour had done its sort of rumour mill around the church, it would have escalated in severity. And so it would have gone from sleeping with a member of the choir to beating his wife and whatever it was, and the community would be compromised and the church would fracture. In modern-day Iran, it was not uncommon for pastors to be captured, taken to prison, held for 4 days, and they would do nothing to them. In fact, they would feed them tea, look after them. And then they'd release them to the community, and the very first question people would ask would be, what happened to you? And they'd say, nothing. I got fed tea, nothing. It was like a hotel. And the church says, nah, what are you lying about? It's not uncommon in that part of the world to be, horrifically abused by your captors. And they'd say, well, if you're lying about that, what else are you lying about? What are you to tell them? All right? And the church would fracture, compromise the community, jump forward into our set in Georgia, gossip, rumour, all of that sort of stuff, and the way it runs through our churches can often leave us unintentionally compromising our community. So we need to make sure we don't do that. And the third one would be support suffocating structures. In Egypt, it's not uncommon for church DAs to take 13 years to go through. Right now, what starts out year 1 as a commitment to build a church and serve a community, year 13 becomes all about getting a building off the ground. Right? The structure has suffocated the original missional focus and left them more focused on building a building than serving a community. That's where 90% of the energy runs inwards at keeping the mechanics of the organisation going. Jump into Western culture. It's where, and by the way, great kids program, jumping castles, car parks, music, lights, sound, none of them are bad things, but it's when the focus of running them precedes your focus on Christ that the imbalance occurs. What we need to do is just make sure the balance is right. Focus on Christ and provide those great services to serve the community, but the balance must be right. And then the last one, the fourth one, is to promote paralyzing people. The underground church in China would say the single most dangerous person to any church is the charismatic leader. They said that person will kill a church in an instant because they will make church more about them than they do about Christ. Jump forward into Western culture. Again, charisma is not a bad thing. The difference for charisma is, or the inflection point for charisma in my view, it's when you use charisma to build up others, or if you use charisma to build up yourself. That's the inflection point. Charisma isn't a bad thing. In fact, in our society and culture, it's needed to drive home messages. But how and what you use it for what purpose matters. Are you using it to build yourself up, or are you using it to build up others? That's the key when it comes to charisma. And so again, you mess with a message, compromise a community, support suffocating structures, or promote paralyzing people. For us as a church, That's our focus. We need to make sure that we are consistent in each of those four.
Mike, you've been so generous with your time and your wisdom. Last question. For those listening that have what you would call maybe an empty or a low spiritual bucket, what encouragement would you give them?
I think I would say that it's okay, full stop, because too often we can think, well, God mustn't be happy with me, or I'm going to go into my shell and not talk about it. I don't know how to language it. I feel alone. I feel distant. I feel like a bad Christian. Maybe I'm not saved. Maybe I'm doing things wrong. Maybe I'm not going there. All these things come up. I actually want listeners to know, hey, you're not alone. I was the CEO of an organisation that supported the persecuted church. I mean, you couldn't get more, this guy must be 100% hooked in Christian charity than that, right? The persecuted church, CEO, Christian, speaking, public, all of those things. And the journey I've walked on, man, I was close to giving it all in, right? And I'm not ashamed of saying that. And people can look at you going, oh my gosh, is this guy? No, man, I still love God, always have. But I was close. And if it can happen, I guess, to people like me, then you need to know it's normal and it's okay. But God has a purpose and a plan for our lives, and it's the journey that makes us great. I talk to friends and loved ones whose kids are off the rails, away from God, and I keep saying, just trust the journey. Trust the journey. We need to get better at trusting the journey, right? Because the longer we try and control, conform, manipulate, or make happen the journey, it just is stressful, anxious, panicky, all of these kind of things. We need to trust the journey, embrace the messiness of life, realize that sometimes life doesn't pan out the way we wanted it to, but it doesn't mean God doesn't love us, and it doesn't make certain people not Christian, right? I think if we can embrace a far more realist gospel that preaches the highs and the lows, then for anyone listening whose bucket is empty, you know what I'd say to them? I love you, I trust you, talk to me about the journey, and we'll walk it together.
Mike Gore, it has been a pleasure having you on Finding Hope today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much to Mike Gore for sharing his heart and story today. To find out more about Charitable, you can download it on the Apple or Android App Store, that is Charitable without the E, or visit their website charitable.org, and that information is in the show notes. I'm Georgia, and thank you for listening today. To help this podcast reach more people, you can rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and also share this episode with a friend who might need a little bit of extra hope right now, or as Mike puts it, maybe their spiritual bucket is a little bit empty. For now, I'll leave you with this verse. For you are called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love, serve one another. Galatians chapter 5, verse 13. Catch you next time.
This is a Hope 1032 production. Thanks for listening.